Welcome to the business interview here on France 24. I'm Matthew Warren. Now, we may be getting richer, but are we any happier? The world is increasingly obsessed with competition, rankings and figures, but have we forgotten the basic human need to work together and cooperate? Well, these are questions posed in a new book by French economist Daniel Cohen, a professor at the Paris School of Economics and the École Normale Supérieure. In English, Homo economicus, lost prophet of modern times. Well, thanks for joining us on the interview, Daniel. Now, could you just start by telling us who is this Homo economicus?
Well, this Homo economicus is a part of ourselves. Each of us has a slice of our soul, which is an Homo economicus. The problem is that we have difficulties organizing our life in between this Homo economicus on the one hand and other dimension of our personality. I give in the very beginning of the book an example which I think summarizes exactly what it is that I have in mind with this story. It's a story of the director of a blood donation service who wants to raise the amount of blood that he has in reserves. And so in order to do that, maybe he has read a book of economics, he offers a premium for the donors who come to give their blood. And the problem is that he realizes that there are less people coming after he introduces these rewards. Why is that so? I think it's very simple. Each of us either give as a gift a part of ourselves to the other people, or they compute where is their interest. But you don't add up these traits of our personalities. It's either or. And the mistake which has been done by this director, and I think this is part of the mistake that is done right now in our society, is that we can't add these things together. We have to choose. And when Homo economicus, this part of ourselves, comes to the table, the other parts move out.
Now, you talk a lot in the book about happiness, the issue of happiness, and the fact that while we're getting richer by many measures around the world, there seems to be a corresponding decline or at least a stagnation in happiness. Can you explain that to us and why that might be happening?
Well, this is related to this story. You get richer, but there are other parts of yourself that you lose, and maybe at the end the balance is negative. Certainly within economics now, and the economists, I think, more or less all agree on that. The extraordinary increase in wealth over the past 50 or 40 years have not been accompanied by an increase in the amount of welfare, of happiness, of well-being. In fact, in the US, for instance, the number of people saying they are very happy has declined by more than a third in between 1950 and today. So there is either a stagnation or a decline. How can it be? For an economist, this is a paradox. In fact, it's called the Easterlin paradox in the literature, because it's Richard Easterlin who was the first to point to these elements. So where does it come from? Well, there's two dimensions, very, very simple to understand. One is simply that one of the great difference between human beings and other animals is that humans have an extraordinary capacity to adapt themselves to all situations. This is great. It means that you can move from north to east and you still remain a human. You can have children with the people who stayed behind. But this capacity of adaptation means that however wealthy you can be, you just adjust to it. It becomes, after some time, 1 year, 2 years, any increase in your wage, in your salary is dissipated. You're back to page one. So this capacity of adaptation explains why you can't increase your happiness. This is relatively straightforward. Money doesn't bring happiness. Everybody understands that. What is less understood, I think, is the fact that this capacity of adaptation is not understood by the humans themselves. There is a saying that Madoff could have said in jail, "I've never been happier than in jail." Well, if you had told Madoff before he went to jail, "You'll be happier," he would not believe you. If I tell you I'm going to double your salary, but it will not change anything, you don't believe me. And the literature is full of stories. You want to leave a woman, she leaves you, and then you're unhappy. We can't anticipate on our feelings. We can't anticipate on our ability to be happy. And this is why we can't react to that. The other dimension of why being wealthier does not make you happier, besides, adapting yourself to the situation even if you're wealthier, is because you always compare yourself to the other. So comparison can mean cooperation, but it can mean competition, and it can bring unhappiness. I want to do better than my neighbor. The neighbor wants to do the same, and we engage into a race where, on average, everything will be lost. So these two dimensions are, I think, the key explanation as to why being immensely wealthier than a century ago, 50 years ago, doesn't make us more happy.
Now, one thing I think is very interesting in the book is you talk about how this is a Western phenomenon, but of course now we're seeing the rise of economies in other parts of the world as well. Are we seeing a new model of how people behave in countries like China, I'm thinking, or not?
Well, what is extraordinary is that what I'm just describing, you're wealthier and you're not happier, happens even in China, where in the last 20 years, the income per head has been multiplied by 4. This is without precedent in the history of the world, a country whose income has been multiplied by 4 in less than 20 years. You would expect, even taking account of everything that I've just said, that the Chinese on average would be happier. This is not the case. The first third is happier, the third wealthier, the last third is less happy, and the median is constant. And altogether, when you aggregate all this, the level of welfare in China is the same as in 1990. This is extraordinary. And why? Because the Chinese are discovering everything that I've just said, which we know in the Western world, but which is still new in China.
And we're talking there about an emerging economy, but one of the other very interesting things you talk about in the book is this comparison between the decline of the Roman Empire and what we're perhaps seeing with the United States at the moment. I'd be interested if you could tell us a bit about what those similarities might be.
Well, this is just an extraordinary discovery for me to read from the specialist, and in particular an American author called Peter Brown, that in the Roman Empire, a situation very similar to the one I'm describing is taking place. That is, after the 3rd century, the Romans were cautious about not showing too much their wealth, were respectful of the city as a whole, and so on, become arrogant about their own wealth. The size of the villas, the private houses of the rich Romans became larger than the temples given to the gods. Wealth exhibited itself. And at that moment, says Peter Brown, the decline of the Roman Empire started. The society became uneven, divided, and then became, really the beginning of the end. There is, I think, a similarity with what's going on in the US. All of a sudden, the values of the American society, a middle-class society, thinking of itself as both individualistic and interested in, of course, wealth and so on, but on the other hand, very communitarian. Tocqueville is very surprised by the extent of communities that exist in the US. All this has been more or less dissipated over the past 50 years. There is a great sociologist at Harvard or Putnam who demonstrate that the American society is more divided than ever, which is something that we hear. And I think this is at the core of this malaise in the US economy and the US society. This sense of brotherhood somehow has been lost.
And do you think that this competitive streak, which seems quite ingrained, is there a way back from that to the more cooperative state that you think is better for us?
I don't know if we can return. That's the problem. There was a golden age in the 50s, in the 60s, everywhere in the Western world, in the US, but as much in Europe and elsewhere, in Japan, let's say perhaps, but where I think we found the proper balance between competition, which is, of course, an ingredient of economic life. You need to compete, obviously, and even as an individual, as an athlete, you need to compete. But you also need places, organization where you cooperate. And in fact, the more intense is a competition, the more you need to resource yourself in areas where you can cooperate with the other in a trustful relationship. This balance, which was found, I think, in the 50s, 60s, big factories where the workers could know that they could rely on the boss to promote themselves and compete to produce more cars, more than the neighbors and so on. This balance has been lost. Now competition, I think, is everywhere, not just on the marketplace as it should be, but also within the firms. To take this example, the bonus, the premium, are there to induce you to do better, more than your neighbors, maybe, than your colleagues. So work has become what it is in the textbook of economics, a pain necessary to gain money. It was not like that. For a lot of people, certainly in the 50s, 60s, and even today, work is a source of enjoyment. You want to produce something. An anthropologist like Claude Lévi-Strauss says, work is much more than just earning money. It's a way of putting your print in society, of existing socially. This has been lost. The value of work has been dissipated, and work is just now a way of making money. So it's a source of happiness that has disappeared.
Well, just in the book as well, you come right up to date. And in the 1 minute that we've got left, I'd be interested to know, you talk about the problems the Federal Reserve had in the 1930s dealing with the crisis then, and liken it to the European Central Bank today. With recent action from Mario Draghi, do you think that perhaps the ECB is learning some lessons?
Well, the paradox of this crisis is that it's really exactly repeating what we've lived through the 30s, and we can build on that. In the 30s, they didn't have Keynes' theory, they didn't know how to manage all these things. Today, we know how to manage it, and we discover that it is very difficult. Mario Monti has a very hard time convincing the Germans that they should act. And why is that so? To stay in the European case, after 50 years of economic integration, nothing has happened. For the Germans, the Greek, the Spanish, and Italian is still foreigners. Economic integration, economic values do not bring the people together. You need to find other ways to do that. This is the failure of a political endeavor, the United States of Europe. This is what the pioneers of the European construction wanted. Economics is not enough.
Okay. Well, Daniel Cohen, as I said, the book is called Homo Economicus, the lost prophet of modern times, is its English translation, although it's just available in French at the moment. But thank you very much for joining us today. And you can follow me on Twitter at MatthewFrance24. Thanks very much for joining us, and we'll have another interviewee next week.